Without further ado, our first speaker, Stan Krpan, is CEO of Solar Victoria. He's responsible for the delivery of the Victorian Government's $1.3 billion solar homes program, which we heard a little bit about this morning, and a range of household incentive programs. Prior to this, Stan was the CEO of Sustainability Victoria for 8 years, where he led a significant expansion and grew the agency's footprint and impact in the areas of climate change, renewables, energy efficiency, and waste and recycling. Stan's had high-profile reform roles for the Victorian Government in building and planning, most recently as co-chair of the Building Victoria's Recovery Task Force and as CEO of the Victorian Cladding Task Force. There's a lot more here, including he was recently recognised with the Public Service Medal in the 2022 Queen's Birthday Honours for outstanding leadership in the areas of environmental and social policy and his work in policy and programme delivery. So we're very lucky to have Stan here this afternoon. Stan's going to be talking about supporting the energy transition through solar and electrification.
Good afternoon, and I'm going to try and project because I can't speak without both hands. So hopefully you can hear me at the back, and if you can't, just reach out and I'll try and make do with a microphone and one less hand to speak with. Thank you, Mike, and thank you to the APVI Institute. I'm delighted to be here and really honoured to be amongst such esteemed colleagues who have really led the world globally on research, obviously on science and engineering, and Australia, as we know, has punched so far above its weight in this area. I also start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we gather, the Wurundjeri of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that we've got Indigenous colleagues amongst us as well, and I pay my respects to them as well. What I wanted to share with you, you've already heard about our program. It's still one of the largest sustainability programs focused on households in the country. Really honoured to lead Solar Victoria. We're now in our 6th year. We sit within the Victorian Government's Department of Energy, Environment and Climate Action. What I wanted to do was share some of the insights that we've gathered over that 5 or 6 years to date, particularly with a focus on households and what I'd call some of the human factors, but then also explore how do we learn from that, how do we learn from some of those customer insights, and then think about the next journey that we've got around electrification and energy transition and the important role that households will play in that. We've achieved significant scale. It's a $1.3 billion program, a commitment to more than 700,000 households, predominantly around solar PV through rebates and interest-free loans, but also a range of other technologies. So if you think household battery storage, heat pump hot water, which is in Victoria at least growing by 500% year on year over the last couple of years, huge interest in electrification. We've also subsidised electric vehicles, heating and cooling upgrades in low-income households, a range of different programs. And in terms of that scale, through the over 300,000 customers that we've supported to date, 1.7 gigawatts of power now effectively distributed across Victorian rooftops. That's already on top of another 350,000 households that had solar before we commenced in 2018. Huge government commitment, very much focused on making it easier for households to afford solar, to make that journey towards electrification. I'll make that link shortly, but also the huge economic benefits that come with it in a state like Victoria that traditionally was lagging behind other states, particularly in the north of the country that perhaps are a bit sunnier. The program was essentially set up, to the government's credit, and by no coincidence, because in terms of our advice, we were pretty steadfast that we had to take account of the underlying risks in the sector when we started in 2018. And I'm not talking about the technology risks, largely proven by that stage, but really the risks of a largely fragmented industry that relied on about 1,000 installers, about 1,000 small businesses that retail solar, at least in this state. and a regulatory risk that we were buying into. And off the back of the Pink Bats Royal Commission, the government had invested to make sure that this program had safety written into it from day one. We have a risk-based audit scheme that underpins the program, and we audit 5% of installations under the program, and have an escalation mechanism and partnerships with regulators that then administers the rectifications and the breaches that might arise out of that. And we make no apology for that, because over the journey, as I'll share with you in a moment, we've managed to work in partnership with the industry, with the peak bodies, to improve standards around installation, the quality of some of the products that are being installed, the retail practices, all of those things that come with an industry that is still, in my view, has huge opportunities for growth. We work closely with co-regulators, so WorkSafe as the health and safety regulator in the state, with Energy Safe Victoria, and you'll see some of the numbers there that they administer in partnership with us, where they undertake joint blitzes and inspections to underpin the regulatory expectations. And since we've started, WorkSafe has prosecuted 15 solar companies in the state. All of those have been removed from the program. And that's largely, when we started in 2018, it was quite acceptable for people in this industry, unlike others. If you think tilers or other people that work on domestic roofs, working with perimeter protection and guarding, it was just not standard practice in the solar sector when we started in 2018. It's now ubiquitous. And we're really proud of that. And as I say, we've worked really closely in partnership, not only with the regulators, but the regulated community, the retailers and installers that underpin the program to achieve that. I'll come back to that in a moment. But there's still issues to address. The Australian Standard 5033 installation and safety requirements came in 2022, and our industry is, it's fair to say, still adjusting to those installation requirements. They're quite strict. I'm not sure about the expectations in other jurisdictions, but in Victoria, Australian standards are automatically incorporated by reference into our electrical safety regulations. And that will continue to be the case. And so essentially, if you're not complying with the Australian standard, it also means you're not complying with electrical safety requirements. And obviously, that's a concern to us. I won't go through all of the common factors that we see, but we regularly publish our audit checklist, we publish our findings, and we publish our results over time as well on a monthly basis. And some of these things, as you'll see just from their description, are things that we need to do better on. Working in collaboration with the industry, as I say, with peak bodies, and in particular the electrical safety regulator, Energy Safe Victoria, we publish our audit checklist. We regularly calibrate them based on what our auditors see in the field, but also with feedback from licensed electrical inspectors, which are mandated here in Victoria to undertake a third-party inspection, but also with the technical bodies, including NECA and the peak bodies that I've already referred to. We've developed a range of technical sheets to support installers in the field, recognising that there's a huge pressure on installers in terms of some of the compliance requirements. Their job is getting increasingly more complex with additional requirements around inverter settings, for instance, network enabled inverters, smart inverters and the like, and that a lot of that pressure focuses on essentially Class A electricians who have got a whole range of other compliance requirements to look after. But we try and support them through technical sheets, through webinars, our auditors taking an educative approach before they look at rectification and escalation, but also technical mentoring for the licensed electrical inspectors who also have to adapt to these technical requirements, and we provide mini training courses in addition to some of the mandatory requirements that we've put. I won't go again through some of these, but all of them are available on our website, and then we co-brand them with the relevant regulators, including Energy Safe, so that they're available there for electricians, particularly because one of the things that we're trying to encourage is that electricians may see solar as an opportunity for them to develop their own skills and complemented now in Victoria by professional development. And that'll be hardwired into, so to speak, the licensed electrical inspectors requirements when we have a designated category for solar installations and renewable energy for licensed electrical inspectors in the next year or so. So one of my key lessons, having been a regulatory practitioner for many years, is that you've got to take account of the regulatory framework and the level of compliance that is underpinning the industry in which you enter. Ideally, government is entering into an industry that is maturing, where it's working in partnership, but is left in a better place than before the government entered. And there's not a great deal of history, unfortunately, in that regard. It's important, given that we're in the critical decade as well, in my view, that we take account of the regulatory framework for those things that are inhibitors potentially to rapid deployment, particularly in the case of renewable energy, and so that they're enablers rather than inhibitors. And there's plenty of examples of how the industry has worked to make sure that those regulatory frameworks are enabling of rapid solar deployment, probably a ways to go in terms of large scale renewable energy deployment. But Australia has really led the way in what some experts call soft costs. In other words, the planning, the connections, the permitting that goes with rapid deployment. And although we all get frustrated by that process, and there's still a level of curtailment of solar exports that is probably not at the level that we'd like as an industry, we're doing a lot better than many other jurisdictions, and in fact have a lot to share in that space. So in terms of the regulatory settings that we've worked in partnership with those regulators to put in place, we've, as I've said, ensured perimeter protection is standard. We've incorporated into our program mandatory safety training for work at height in particular for every one of the 1,000 installers that work in this industry, but also importantly the 4,000 other workers. So if you think people who are in apprenticeship, pre-apprenticeships, labourers, who are coming in and out of the industry, depending on the level of take-up, that all of those people are mandatorily trained under our program as well in order to participate. And I've already talked about the licensed electrical inspector category that we've worked closely with ESV to implement, which again will be one of these measures that will improve the industry over time. So to do all of that, we recognise we don't work in isolation. In fact, we work in a really complex ecosystem of Commonwealth and state regulators, but importantly in partnership with industry. From day one, we've worked really closely with the Smart Energy Council and Clean Energy Council. They're represented on our industry and consumer reference group, and importantly, as the name suggests, it incorporates consumer advocates as well, so that we're striking the right balance between industry development and expansion, as well as consumer protection, which has been a big issue for the industry to come to terms with. For our part, at least, I'm really pleased that we've had absolute support from the peak bodies to make sure that we're working in lockstep to advance the industry over time. And the ICRG has been a really important accountability mechanism for me and my staff, but also to make sure that we're working together as standards evolve. And as I say, they're committed to the industry developing over time as well. So you'll recognise from that I take a pretty interventionist view about the role of government, but also a role for government that I think is a responsibility when you're investing this much into an industry, that you actually leave the industry in a better place, and that we leverage that level of investment for the benefits of the industry and also, of course, for our customers as well. And so we recognise that we've got this opportunity to shape markets, and I'll touch on some of those examples. We do that primarily through what's called a notice to market, and my colleagues here who are the authors of that document would be more than happy to speak to you during the day if you've got questions about how it works, but also some of the requirements that we've put in. What we've tried to do is make sure that as much as possible, the technology that is going in to people's homes is future-proofed. So for instance, with internet capabilities, smart inverters were then mandated in Victoria under our program from 2019, ahead of the Australian standard requiring it. And we're trying to do a similar thing with recommendations for the interoperability protocol, CCIP-OZ in other words, to enable dynamic exports. Again, it's our view that before we get to an emergency backstop, and there's an active consultation in Victoria around the need for an emergency backstop, that a flexible exports, dynamic exports arrangement that benefits customers before you get to that situation is probably better off for everybody. We also mandate whole of system product warranties for all of our products, but in particular, and you'll hear from this from my colleague Paul later in the day, for heat pumps and for PV, and we've done that as standard since day one as well. We subsidise about 85% of solar installs in Victoria, and so that kind of gives us the opportunity to influence that market, as I say, and for the benefits of the industry, but also consumers. So I want to shift tack a little bit to the role of consumers and customers, and also what we've learned from people. At Solar Victoria, we recognise that consumers have a critical place in the energy transition, but also that we've got to bring the community with us. And there's no better example anywhere in the world, in my view, than in the rapid take-up of residential solar. I say rapid, but it's been 20 years in the making, right? 20 years to be an overnight success. But I seriously mean it, that customers have been brought along that journey, and in many of the many situations, and what our customers tell us is that 3/4 of them are taking up solar because they think that it's going to save them money, and for the most part, they're satisfied with the savings that they're making, even with the feed-in tariff reducing over time necessarily. But we've recognised how important the role of consumers in bringing them along and meeting them where they are in terms of their attitudes and what their drivers and motivations are is actually more important than just their take-up of solar. It's actually building us social licence for some really difficult decisions ahead of us around electrification, around some of the technologies, around replacing technologies and appliances in people's homes for which they're not yet prepared. And so our view is that solar gives us an entree, if you like, into understanding how consumers operate and making life easier for them as they move towards electrification. And that the 3 million Australian homes, and growing rapidly by the day, who are already connected to solar have this opportunity to see that as part of their journey towards electrification, because overwhelmingly what they want is to maximise that investment. But that social licence for transition is going to be critical, because in my view, the climate wars are not yet over, and we shouldn't take for granted the community's level of support, and that we'll need to continuously work with the community. So what do our customers tell us? I've already given you a sneak preview that 73% of them say that they're saving as much as they expected, but it's the overwhelming reason for taking it up. And then second is the environment. But they are still a strong motivating factor. And in fact, what we see is this dual motivator for the next step beyond solar. So whether it's a battery, whether it's an electric vehicle, an all-electric home, and in Victoria at least, with a ban on new gas connections from the 1st of January of next year, seeing solar as an opportunity to electrify those homes is a really key enabler. So it shows us that our customer insights show us that customers are already primed for that next step. And in many cases, more than 2/3 of them tell us that they already, as soon as they get their solar, they make an adjustment to how they live, particularly in the way that they use their appliances. So if you think washing machines, heaters, dryers, etc., things that are taking up electricity during the day, that they program them or optimise them so that they're using them during the day, which is a fantastic thing. 4 out of 5 of them are interested in another rebate, which won't be surprising to you. But it indicates also that they're contemplating alternatives to gas heating, which is incredibly important in Victoria, where most of our energy is used to heat our homes, and then secondly to heat water rather than the lights and the TV and the beer fridge out the back. And so solar's not going to really help them with those two bills if, like most of the 2 million homes in Victoria, they're still connected to gas. So optimising the investment in solar is, in my view, a really important enabler. So I'll touch on electrification. Our long-term vision, and it won't surprise you by what I've said so far, is a shared vision with the Victorian government that people will move to all-electric homes over the future. That they will be increasingly all-electric, that they'll have an electric vehicle in the garage, and increasingly with batteries as well. And as I say, it complements the government's policy agenda, which is to get households off gas as soon as possible, and particularly in the next couple of years. And so having worked in sustainability for more than a decade, and having worked on energy efficiency, and like many of you, understood how hard it is to convince people that energy efficiency is actually a fantastic thing for them, that it will make their lives healthier and more comfortable, it's a really difficult sell. However, I see solar as an opportunity to work with our customers, as I said, meeting them where they are and seeing that there's an opportunity for them to maximise that investment, because 3/4 of the power that most of our solar systems are generating is actually exported to the grid. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing when you've got such an ambitious target around renewable energy, but it's not the best thing for the customer. Electrifying their home and pushing that 25% out to 50%, as many businesses with solar do, is actually the most beneficial for them. So, as you can probably tell, I'm pretty buoyant about the sector. I'm buoyant about the level of consumer support for solar, and that gives us an opportunity towards electrification, but also about a number of opportunities at a national level. And I'm really pleased to see that some of these matters will be discussed over the next couple of days over this conference. The first is around the opportunity around local manufacturing, assembly, and particularly R&D. And I know I share that with many of you in the room. But I haven't given up on the opportunity around local manufacturing, and particularly around opportunities not only in solar but also in heat pumps and compressors as well. End-of-life handling, and some of the presenters will be speaking about that. Again, we can't contribute to the problems that we say that we're moving away from. And the waste of the first generation of solar PV panels is already hitting our transfer stations and landfills, even with a landfill ban. Although 3/4 of solar panels at end of life in Victoria at least are reprocessed, it's mostly only the metal that's recycled. And so the glass, we need to do something about that. I know there's technical solutions, but doing that at scale and doing it locally will be a huge opportunity, but is also a downside risk in my view around that social licence that I mentioned as well. And there are a number of initiatives, both federally and at a state level, that are seeking to support both local manufacturing and assembly, as well as end-of-life processing. An Energy Innovation Fund from the state government, Energy Technologies Manufacturing Fund, which is open for applications currently and expressions of interest. We're yet to hear, I think, the details of the National Reconstruction Fund federally, but of the $15 billion that will be invested through the authority, now chaired by Martijn Wilder, who'll be known to many of you as a former chair of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, $3 billion of that will be invested in renewable energy, including energy technology manufacturing. And then the Breakthrough Victoria Fund, which is administered by the Victorian government, and it has a specific solar challenge on R&D for recycling and end-of-life handling. So I'll bring that to an end with just a couple of themes, really 6 themes that for me are lessons from our program, but also quite relevant in my view to electrification and energy transition. And unsurprisingly, they have a real focus on households. The first is not to underestimate the complexity of implementation. Government programs are really hard to administer, and indeed anything at scale is hard to administer, but it needs to be built from the ground up in partnership with the industry in order to be successful. And for us, it was really important that we succeed in this program, having learnt the lessons of the past, given the scale and the intensity of what we need to deliver in the next 7 years, and that we can't do that on our own. The second is understanding and managing the underlying risks, the regulatory framework and how it relates to those and how it can be an enabler rather than an inhibitor, working in partnership, the importance of social licence, particularly for the community that we serve. And finally, in order to do that, to understand what the temperature, if you like, is in the community, is working really hard to understand the customer. Thanks very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thanks, Dan. I think we've got time for a couple of questions, if you're willing. I'm going to take chair's privilege and sneak one in if I can. You talked a lot about the importance of installers and educating installers around the technical side and from a safety perspective. Do you see a role for installers as the kind of front line of the industry, customer facing in terms of advocacy and soft diplomacy around electrification as well as solar?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Mike, for the question. What our customers overwhelmingly tell us is that they trust their retailer, and in most cases that's the same person as their installer. At least they're in a small company. I think it's over 80%. We measure that satisfaction for every customer that comes through, obviously with our program as well. And they're a really important interface. And in my view, that gives the solar industry the opportunity to be a part of that electrification journey. They might not have thought about themselves as installing smart chargers, for instance, for electric vehicles, or working in heat pumps, but increasingly there's this convergence where in an all-electric home, it makes sense that your electrician can help you with a whole-of-home solution. They won't do that on their own. As I said, I think there's a lot of pressure on installers And indeed, I think the OEMs have a real responsibility for much of the stuff that we devolve down to installers. But on this one, where they have this enduring relationship with customers, I think they're uniquely well placed.
Thank you. Too many people. Yes, gentleman up there.
Hello, Stan. Thanks for your presentation. My name is Erwin Boermans. I'm a sessional lecturer at 4 different unis. And I get at dinner time inundated with phone calls that they want to replace your gas-fired unit to a heat pump. I'm an industry nerd, and I always ask them, why can't you install one with a chemical, non-chemical refrigerant? And 99.9% cannot install one with a natural refrigerant, where we need to phase out all those nasty chemical refrigerants. Can you please take action in that field? Because it will be a major problem with the phase out of all those units.
Thanks, Eric. I think it's a really important call out. We can't project ourselves as the solution if we're creating externalities and environmental problems downstream. And at the moment we are. Refrigerants is one example. I also talked about end of life, where there really aren't those technical solutions. We need to be thinking more holistically about those things. In terms of the refrigerants, there are specific, globally, but also in this state, moves towards removing the climate warming potential of some of the refrigerants. But I know that there's also solutions around natural refrigerants, and it is something that's on the government's radar. I can't commit to when that'll be implemented, but it is definitely something that we're thinking about. Thank you, Eric.
Squeeze one more. Richard.
Thank you, really nice talk. Richard Corkish from University of New South Wales. On one of your slides, you had a dot point about mandatory serial numbers, and I don't think you spoke about it, but if that was referring to PV equipment, is that system dependent on the maintenance of the federal government's SRES, which is destined to close in 2030? And are you intending to go beyond that?
Yeah, thanks. So firstly, we do work really closely with the Clean Energy Regulator, and we exchange data. So we know where the PV systems are. We know that they've got a registration system. They've done great stuff there, and we can exchange that. That specific reference was about batteries, and unfortunately, there isn't a requirement at the moment for, other than the CER, which doesn't apply to household batteries, obviously, that they're not required to register where they've installed them, what the serial numbers or anything like that, which makes a recall nigh on impossible. We're working with LG at the moment, and I think it's 1,600 batteries have been installed that are subject to a recall with some fire risks attached to it. APSRC endorsed all of that. Only half of them have been recalled and replaced at this stage because there was no requirement for installers or retailers to record the serial numbers. So something as basic as that, we're requiring under our notice to market. Yeah, so it wasn't a specific reference to PV, but to batteries. But of course, it applies to both, that we do require those records so that it can make recalls in particular, accessible. Thanks, Richard.
Thanks, Stan. I think
Thank
that's
you.
all we've got time for. Thank you, Stan.